Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Demystifying the Hunt, How to Assess Your Threat Hunting Readiness and Prepare for the Next Step, sponsored by Optiv and Corelight. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Gary Fisk, Sales Engineer at Corelight, Fayez Rajpari, Global Executive Services Director at Optiv, and Matt Bromley, SANS Certified Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to John Gamble of Corelight, who will be moderating today's webcast.
Thanks, Carol. This is John Gamble here, Director of Product Marketing at Corelight. As Carol mentioned, I'll be emceeing today's webcast. We'll be starting off with kind of a roundtable discussion with the three gentlemen you see here on screen. But I was wondering if we could first start with maybe just a little bit of background from you guys about kind of where you're at in your career and kind of where you got your threat hunting knowledge. And Fayez, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Fayez Rajpari. I'm currently the Executive Services Director at Optiv. Started earlier in the year, so I've been here for almost been a year now, but going about 8 or 9 months. But before that, I spent my time 5.5 years in Mandiant. Did a variety of different things from technical sales to customer success and also product management. Learned a lot from the Mandiant side, and then before that, I was at Symantec. Primarily a core architect covering all of Symantec's core products. And before that, I was actually a lead incident response handler and basically dabbled in every security domain possible in 10 years prior to joining the vendor and the partner side.
Awesome. Thanks. Gary?
So I started in security on working with Oracle on the data security and identity management front. Went over to work with Mandiant, where Fayez and I crossed paths for about, actually, I suppose it's longer than a path when we worked together for about 4 years through the acquisition with FireEye. And I've now been with Corelight for a couple of years, having jumped over to the NSM side of the house.
Great. Thanks, Gary. And Matt?
Hey, John, Corelight folks, good to talk to you again. Those of you watching, thank you for joining. I'm sure we've had a chance to meet before, so I'm excited to have everyone here today. Matt Bromley, SANS instructor. I'm also part of the analyst program, and I've got some experience in working through, too long of an experience. I don't like to count the numbers anymore, of experience in incident response, digital forensics, threat hunting, and really just kind of a day-to-day interaction of keyboard-to-keyboard combat, I call it, with threat actors. Has given me a nice perspective, and I'm excited to bring that to everyone here today. But thanks for joining us, John, and thanks for making us start off with who we are.
Thanks, Matt. Quick agenda for the audience. So we're going to start with some kind of seed questions to get these panelists talking about how they think about threat hunting and some of the key things to be aware of. Then we'll move into how to assess your readiness and kind of breaking down threat hunting into its core components. And we'll walk through each of those components so you can help self-assess where you fit in on that spectrum in terms of readiness. Then we'll talk about putting that into practice. What are the steps you need to take to actually operationalize a hunt in your own environment across those dimensions? And lastly, we'll actually have 2 sample hunts. Gary and Matt will present 2 example hunts where we kind of put our learnings into practice and show you a really concrete example of how to hunt against 2 specific theses. And we'll keep Q&A mostly for the end. As Carol mentioned, you're welcome to ask questions throughout. We will see that in the panel there. We're probably going to save most questions until the end just for time. So please ask your questions and we will follow up at the end. And if we don't have time, we can follow up directly with you via email. So with that, let's go into the roundtable discussion. The first question I have for the panelists is what is threat hunting? How do you define it? It's a topic that a lot of people are interested in the industry today, but I think for those that haven't done it before or have a lot of experience, it can be a little bit mystifying. Gary, maybe you could start us off. Do you have any thoughts about how you define threat hunting?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally dealing with events when there are no alerts, when there's nothing that you don't have the big flashing red light that says something needs attention. It can take a lot of different forms, but at the end of the day, it's if you don't have alerts going off, does that mean that everything is okay? Threat hunting is the understanding that it's usually not. it should be driven by a hypothesis. It should be structured in a way, but it needs to be based on an understanding of what normal behavior is like. But fundamentally, it is dealing with events when there are no events that are immediately visible.
Great. Fayez, do you have a comment?
Yeah, definitely. I always love to hear others comment on this definition and what it means to them, because there's so many out there, right? So, I mean, if you really define cyber threat, it basically means to the malicious act of stealing or damaging or disrupting, right? And if you think of what hunting really is, it's basically exploration or following something through. So if you kind of put these together, in my simplest definition, it's basically the investigation or exploration of evil that you really have not detected by traditional mechanisms.
Great. I love that word exploration, because while I don't have a threat hunting background, having gotten to meet a few threat hunters over my career in info security, I can definitely say that that's what I've learned from them. Is it's an exploratory process where you don't necessarily know what the end outcome is. Matt, do you have any closing thoughts on this question?
I just not really outside of echoing sentiments of what everyone said. I think it's Gary, you said something that really rung true with me. Is it's something that gives you an understanding and awareness of your environment when there's not alerts blinking at you. And for me, threat hunting is taking the initiative and following the thread of, I want to understand more about my environment and more about things that I should be prepared for, number one, and number two, the things that aren't throwing blinky flashy alerts that we should be watching out for. And I think everyone summed up some of the same thoughts of it's an exploration, and Fayez, I can't top that word, so I'm going to end it on that.
Great, thanks, Matt. So the next question I have for you guys is, as a hunter, where do you look for evidence? I think that's a question that's often top of mind for someone who's just getting into threat hunting. Where do I start? Where do I look? Fayez, maybe you could start us off with your thoughts there.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a really good question, right? So it all comes down to data, right? I mean, it comes down to where all compromises are occurring and how they get there, right? So there's numerous facets of data, and if you kind of again put it back into simplest definition, the network endpoint, but digging deeper in this can be really looking for any form of logs or that you are producing, right? So it doesn't make any sense to look for evidence if you don't have that evidence, right? So for example, if you don't have packet captures or if you don't have the network meta, then there is no point in looking for that evidence. It could be down to specific security logs as well, anything generated from like authentication devices. I'm a big proponent of looking for the who's and who's been accessing that data and what was carried out. But again, most importantly, it needs to be data that you can generate.
Great, thanks, Fayez. Matt, any thoughts?
Yes, yeah. So it's really easy to stand here and say something like, everywhere, right? But honestly, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, John. But for me, part of the activity of threat hunting is gaining awareness of your environment, right? And I'm going to quote you multiple times using the word exploration. And I think as you're going through your environment, as you're going through and learning about what you could potentially be susceptible to, what you may be susceptible to currently, what you were susceptible to, right? If we look at retroactive activity, I really have a hard time putting it down a particular source, but I think the easiest way to classify it is both host and network based together are artifacts that I look at without a doubt, because an attacker trips and causes ripples in both of those things as they move throughout an environment. So I hate saying everything, but honestly, it's hard to exclude something if you're just getting started out.
Thanks, Matt. Gary, any closing thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you use different evidence for different things. That network evidence, for instance, is a good way to get very broad aperture visibility to a large set of data about lots and lots of things, to be able to identify outliers that require additional investigation. Endpoint gives much deeper data, but is a little harder to correlate across an environment. So, the snarky answer of you use any data you can find is certainly true. They're useful for different things as you go through a hunt. And another important thing to keep in mind is that you use all the data that you have, but if there are missing pieces of data, you also have to use your experience in the hunt process to identify places where you need additional information, where if you keep hitting dead ends in the same place, that's a good indicator that you might need more visibility there, or if you end up having to do a lot of extrapolation. So network is great for broad visibility and a good place to start browsing around for things that are outliers. Network or endpoint data is very useful for sort of digging in and getting down into the weeds once you figure out where you need to go.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Next question for you guys. How do you form strong hunting hypotheses? Matt, do you have any thoughts there?
Yes. So we will actually hit upon a couple of these topics as we start working through them. But one of the things from a hypothetical standpoint that I like to tell a lot of organizations I work with to focus on is first, what's realistic for you? Your hypotheses and the hunting that you intend to set out to do and you intend to either prove or disprove should be something that can actually be realized inside of your environment and should be something that is a question that you actually need to answer. And a quick example would be if I work in a particular industry that is being targeted by a certain someone or is susceptible to certain vulnerabilities or a certain thing is going on that's currently in the news and I'm not seeing it flashing alerts, but I want to go through and dig and I'm going to use that as my hypothesis and my baseline, make sure it's a relevant thing that you start to approach through. Don't just sort of look at your environment, throw a dart against the wall and say, let's see if we are vulnerable to this or if this is going on. Do it with intention and start out with things that are relevant to your org first.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Gary, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, and the other thing that is important to remember is that this is an iterative process, and your first hypothesis is probably going to not be as helpful as you'd like it to be. You will, along the way, learn what normal things are. You're going to find lots and lots of false positives, and that's actually a really good thing because that means you understand your network better than you did before. One of my colleagues has a line that he uses regularly that if you've seen one network, you've seen one network, and this is something that's true whether you're dealing across the board with large-scale data volumes, that everybody's environment is going to be fundamentally different. So you're going to start with a hypothesis, but iterate through it. If you're on the right, you can be on the right track and still get wrong answers. But that's still a successful thing if you can fine-tune what you're doing and identify better the sorts of questions that you should be asking.
Great. Fayez, any closing thoughts here?
Yeah, so really good thoughts here, guys. Agree with both Gary and Matt here. One thing that Matt mentioned was, around more of the adversarial knowledge, right? Understanding like what are you doing and why are you doing that, right? So I take the approach of actually when you're trying to form a strong hypothesis, understanding both the victim and the asserter side of things is so important, right? So what are you searching for? What are you looking for? And even from the adversarial side of things, like what are they after and why? And so given my background and where I came from, like, intelligence-led hypothesis is so imperative. By gaining that adversarial knowledge, you can then understand their tactics, their techniques, their procedures of the bad guys, and really form a strong hypothesis so you can carry out a hunt around those TTPs in your organization. So I'll just end off with that. Thanks.
Thank you. Last question for you guys. If you look back on your careers, were there any aha moments you had? Have you worked with threat hunters that you just thought were really excellent and you kind of learned from them? In your guys' opinion, what do you think makes the most successful threat hunters successful? If there's a thing or two that really stood out to you in your career, is there one piece of advice you could give somebody about threat hunting who's getting started? Gary, maybe we could start with you.
Just to continue, this is turning. At some point, we're going to have to disagree about something here because this has all been sort of a giant love fest so far. But to follow on Fayez's point, is that this is where the defenders get to put on attacker hats. The people who are really good at threat hunting are people who are able to approach their environment from the outside and say, what would an adversary want to get from me? And what would they know ahead of time to be able to attempt to achieve that goal? So like I said, there's a little bit of a you put on your hat and assume you're the other guy. You don't know what you know what they know. I think that is an important, it's an important thing to be able to do to be successful. B, it makes it a really entertaining thing to do. It makes it just a lot more fun to be able to play dress up and be the bad guy for once. and play attacker instead of defender.
Thanks, Gary. Fayez, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, and one thing, and this is something that I've learned here, being at Optiv for about 9 months, collaboration and thinking outside the box, right? So just as the most advanced, effective, adversaries are out there, you think of ones, as there's reports by FireEye and others that are out there that adversaries that don't go detected for hundreds of days. Many times, obviously, we've all read reports on ones that haven't been detected for 1,000 days, right? How is that so? There's a reason for this, right? So I'll call out APT41. If APT41 has been known to be in environments for, I think that I read was like over a year or around a year before they were even detected, or in cases where they weren't detected for that long. But once they were detected, they were able to get back in by changing their tactics and procedures in a matter of a few days. So the question really is, are you quick enough to detect and understand the perceived goals and how they can get in once they change their tactics, right? So again, how do you do that? Then I'll touch on this later in our talk too, around how we can collaborate and thinking outside the box and talking to various different groups within the organization and really understanding and writing off their experiences to make sure that the hunts that are being carried out are successful and are effective. So yeah, that's my thoughts are right now. So
Matt, any closing thoughts here?
Yes, I don't have a disagreement, Gary, yet, but I do have a different angle on this one. One thing I'd recommend, and one thing that I've found successful, is to find a win in every single hunt that you do. And I've made this comparison before. If we'll rope in the traditional hunting term, and if you go out hunting for a particular deer or whatever it may be, if you don't catch something, you come back like, I failed, right? This hunt failed because I didn't get what I went after. And I've seen information security folks say the exact same thing. They'll go out and they'll hunt. They'll be like, I'm going to go look for APT, whatever, inside of my environment. And they don't find it. And they come back and they say, well, that was a loss. We didn't find what we were looking for. And I'm like, first off, let's not assume that particular group was there, number one. Number two, if you found new visibility, if you developed a new tool, wrote a new script, deployed a new log, whatever it may have been, find that win in everything you do and give every hunt purpose. And, some hunts will end in goose eggs, and that should be celebrated because as long as you're confident you've exhausted everything you could go after, hey, we're, clean slate on the things that we went after here. So, find success in every one, I think is a good mantra to keep in mind.
Thanks, Matt. And I think I'll add to that, even though I'm the moderator here, I got to talk to some threat hunters at a financial conference a couple months ago.
Yes, you agree, right?
Well, I agree. But one thing they added that it relates to your point, Matt, is they talked about the hunts that didn't succeed. And they said, A, that they always learned something, but B, they also knew when to move on. And I thought that was a pretty interesting insight. Is someone in the audience actually asked them, well, how do you know when to move on? And they said, well, we kind of capped the exercise and we know that we need to try something else and constantly keep iterating and learning, because they're, with every hunt, whether they find what they're looking for or not, they were always learning. So I plus one to what you just said, Matt. So far, no disagreement. We'll see as we head into the next couple sections. So let's move into some kind of practical kind of guidance here. This next section, we're going to look at how do you, as someone who's presumably pretty new to threat hunting or just getting your kind of start in threat hunting in the last year or so, how do you assess the maturity of where you're at? And how do you think about your maturity curve of your threat hunting program? So with that, Fayez, I'll turn this over to you for this slide.
Yeah, sure. So, man, it's so hard to disagree with you guys. There's been so many good conversation here, but maybe I'll set the foundation here, and please, guys, chime in if you feel otherwise. But so really, it's around setting the foundation, right? So if you kind of look at this pyramid, and you look at the bottom around business alignment, I really feel that that's the most important item before you can move into a mature hunt program, right? Is to really understand your business model and how that maps back to why you're even hunting, right? Hunting is not cheap. It's an expensive proposition to the business. So, and it can be risky if it's not done properly. So yeah, I guess I will disagree a little bit around, finding hunting and then finding goose eggs. And I like your spin to it, Matt, where you basically said, hey, it's fine. which I agree. But if you're continuously doing that and you're just finding goose eggs, then something maybe needs to be iterated upon and change quickly, right? Because if you're continually finding goose eggs, then you know you're going to have a hard time convincing your business that you want to continue to do this, because then typically what'll happen is when you're convincing the businesses is there's going to be in basically the next layer of the pyramid is a risk-driven conversation, right? Thinking about how you can reduce the risk of intrusions and be ready to answer why it is important. So do they know why they're doing this? In the situations you're hunting for someone, it's not a thing, or it's usually someone that's after your business. So some questions to ask around this, when you're getting that business alignment and going through that risk-driven approach is, well, number one is like, what business are you in? Are you a financial organization? Are you manufacturing? Is it healthcare? Think about how this will reduce the risk of intrusions, and then moving into that risk-driven approach of actually building a hunt program to align to your business that would allow you to have a goal to reduce that overall risk and increase your security posture. If you can proactively find intrusions in a manner that's quick enough to reduce that overall risk, then you've basically made a case to the business, right? That you're basically finding and catching the bad guys before even. Why are you doing it? Well, if you think about it, like you're really trying to reduce your risk, but then also reduce incidents that are occurring, or maybe a theft that's occurred already. Then you've essentially proven the importance to that business, right? So moving up to the next tier is the outcome focus. How are you doing this? Like, what is your outcome like? The outcome includes, really, it's just the discovery of the attacker, right? Or the threat within the environment. More importantly, think about how you will achieve that outcome via discovering whether there are tactics or techniques or procedures. I can give an example, right? Examples that, my prior life, we'd be looking for would be persistence mechanisms, maybe on a Windows system through registry items or scheduled tasks or credential harvesting, whatever that is. Have those outcomes on what you're looking for and make sure you can focus on those, so you can then basically at that point you can actually have some and next year again is a measured success, right? Or if it's not successful, to Matt's point earlier, it's okay if there's some goose eggs, but as long as you can iterate upon that and have some success there and have some measurements around it. The other thing that I mentioned, I heard you guys talking about earlier, is capping that, right? So is there some time bounds to it, right? You can't just continually go on that hunt without having any success in it, right? So is there something that you're capping where you're saying, okay, well, it was measured. I did this for, say, continuous hunt for 5 days, or 2 days, or whatever that is. Have some measurements around it, and then only then is that where you'll be able to actually provide some reporting, right? How can you report if it's not measured? It's just there's going to be no reporting aspect, and reporting is extremely important as well, because then once you have that, then you can then look at that and say, okay, well, this is what didn't work, and these are things that worked, and then you can then continually iterate on that process and then go back to the whole business alignment, risk-driven, outcome focus, and measured, right? So that's all end with, and that's really the foundational elements around maturing your hunt program. So we can go to the next slide there.
Well, and here's one we may have a little bit of contention on. There's been a lot of, I've seen a number of discussions on Twitter and elsewhere about the value of attribution. Does it matter who's attacking you, and related topics? And those tend to be a discussion. The contention around that tends to be around people who are coming at this from different levels of maturity within a hunt program. A little bit of an echo. Hopefully that's clear now. In most cases, identifying whether the group that's attacking you is party A or party B, for most organizations doesn't particularly matter. You're not going to do much that's very different. However, from a program design perspective, there's a tremendous amount of really good reporting that's done on these threat actors and what sorts of things they are doing. And staying aware of the groups that are targeting the organizations that you're in is a really valuable thing in and of itself. The odds of you researching a particular group and finding that particular group happens to attack your organization is actually probably pretty small. However, the bad guys are all reading the same reports that you are. And understanding the kinds of activities that are out there will inform the rest of the program definition that you're going to be doing. I am particularly skeptical of this in that, the groups do pivot, they change what they're doing. The Chinese APT groups didn't care about healthcare until they did in 2014. So you don't get tunnel vision on it. Look at the people that are in the industries that you're in. Look at, if you're looking at financial groups, see how those financial groups are changing the tools and tactics that they're using. Build your hunting program around that, because these tend to be more the folks who get write-ups tend to be the more sophisticated folks, and there are these are the kinds of things that are hard to detect using traditional detection routines in a lot of cases. But if you have some hunting tools in place, you can at least start identifying anomalies and outliers that might point you in the right direction. And again, an important piece to remember is that if you have somebody who is reading the reports on what APT-12 is doing, they could be doing some of the same things that APT-12 is doing, but they're probably not going to be doing it as well. So you're more likely to find them because they're reading somebody else's cookbook. But if you don't know that recipe has been written down, you don't know where to start looking.
Thanks, Gary. Matt, do you want to talk about MITRE attacks and techniques and tactics?
I do. So before I do that, Gary, I don't know if I have a disagreement. I won't call it a disagreement, but there's something that you said that I wanna pick up on. So with regards to MITRE, I think what you started going towards was focusing on the tools and the techniques of how a particular group does what they do. And John, if you could go ahead and hit one advancement for me here. We've got a pop-out box here. For example, let's say you've got a group that is taking advantage of, or they're utilizing lateral movement in some way, shape, or form. Now, what the nice thing about the MITRE attack matrix is that it gives us the ability to have what I like to refer to as kind of a common vocabulary. Meaning, when we talk about the word lateral movement and what does lateral movement mean, we all now have this common repository where we can go to and we can define what that is. But where the attack matrix becomes absolutely crucial when it comes to threat hunting is if I give you a report, to Gary's point, if I give you a report that talks about a certain APT group, and in reading that APT group, I say that they utilize a certain type of lateral movement, they utilize a certain type of credential harvesting, and you're sitting back as a threat hunter and you're like, well, I've never encountered these things before. And I'll speak on behalf of Fayez and Gary really quick. It's really easy for someone to come to us and be like, oh yeah, we saw this group that came in, they stole a bunch of Kerberos tickets, they did some password hashing, so on and so forth, and then they went and did this and that, and we're like, yep, got it, and it's a checklist. But if you're unfamiliar with what some of those terms may mean, or you're reading a report and you're kind of like, I have no clue what that thing is, the MITRE attack matrix gives you that nice little common framework, that common vocabulary, like I mentioned, where you can go and actually read and see how we're applying this particular language here. But where I want to I don't want to call it an add-on to what Gary was saying. The link I want to make maybe between the techniques and the groups is, as a threat hunter, if you let's talk about intelligence-led hunting for just a second here. If I come to you and I say to your organization, hey, org, you guys are inside of this industry, I think you're being targeted by whatever group, or my favorite release ever is, hey, industry, everyone else, all of your competitors have been hit by this particular threat group. And then someone sits back and says, well, good thing we haven't. And like, I'm one of those, if everyone's knocking on the door in the neighborhood and you live in that same neighborhood, just wait, they'll be knocking on there soon. But the nice thing is threat hunting puts you in that proactive stance, and you can start to learn how these groups do what they do. And then you can start to apply that intelligence knowledge towards one of your hunts, if you will. But the bridge that I want to make here is, let's say we have a threat group who utilizes a bunch of different techniques. And you go through and you read that particular report and you learn how that group does what they do. And you're like, all right, everyone, I've got this intelligence-led hunt. We're going to go looking for APT-41 or APT-12 or 3 or 10 or whoever it may be. All right, let's go out and let's find lateral movement. And then all of a sudden the team comes back and looks you in the face and they say, how do we find lateral movement? And we're going to answer this question a little bit later here. But the nice thing about the group and the group layout and the attack matrix layout is it says, well, you know what? I don't have the ability to find lateral movement right now. Oh, but wait, these guys do exfiltration over this port and protocol. I do have the ability to view that. So let me instead shift towards this other part of that group's techniques. And instead of looking for one particular technique that you may have limited visibility to, pivot through that group data and then just start to check off the list. Now, you're not done, right? Those of you starting out in threat hunting, because if you don't have the ability to hunt through and find things like lateral movement, we got to address that problem. But if you wanted to start to craft intelligence-driven hunts based off of where you're currently at, take a look at all the different pieces and then start to line those up. But the overall message here is, once again, I don't want you to find a group. I want you to find a technique. I want you to explore a technique in your environment and see if you can detect that, but use groups as those nice guiding points of here's maybe what I should focus on or care about first before the rest.
That's a great overview, Matt. Thank you. And it sparked something in my mind that I'll just add as a capstone on that. The same threat hunters that I mentioned earlier that I met at the financial services conferences, not only does this language, this MITRE ATT&CK TTP language, give you a common language across industries, so you can go read these reports and kind of everyone's speaking the lingua franca of the same tactics and techniques, but it gives you the same commonality within your own organization. And these two threat hunters were actually talking about how when they were doing network-based threat hunting, they were tagging their hunts with these specific TTPs that you see here. Well, you can see some of them here, at least the one we pulled forward, T1076. And by doing that, that allowed them to go back to the broader SOC and everyone involved in their security operations and coordinate. And so the vulnerability management side of the house was working off of this, and they could all get together and meet as a group and talk about how they, as a team across all of their different disciplines, were addressing risk in their organization, which I thought was a pretty great way to collaborate at an organization. With that, maybe Fayez, you can kind of introduce us to the 5 frames of threat hunting maturity that we'll be talking about.
There we go. I was on mute there. Wow, that's a great conversation. So yeah, and just before I get into this, right, you know, Matt hit on some topics around the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and almost seems like the Lockheed Martin cyber attack kill chain has just been kind of put on the back burner and in the dust. It's the speck in the dust. And I think that's also important to what Matt was mentioning earlier, was that the reason why I feel like MITRE ATT&CK has gained so much momentum is, like, you know, Matt mentioned, it's the how, and understanding those techniques. But I think that we should not disregard the cyber attack you know, kill chain as well, because that also it aligns to how the attackers operate. But again, it's difficult for as you're going through this, the 5 areas of threat hunting maturity, is if you aren't mature, then you won't really understand how to actually look for lateral movement, right? So it really helps that attack framework really gives you that prescriptive you know, advice on the hows and where to look for specific things, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but when you move into the 5 areas of threat hunting maturity, I like to kind of think of this as this key questions that you should be asking around if you can get to this hunting maturity. It really comes down to what you are hunting, which is that intelligence, right, on the right side. It's where you will find it, which is that data on the left side, how you will find it, those tools, right? And then when will you find it, right? So when are you going to find it, and who are you going to use, right? So again, people and process. And lastly, the automation side of things it really comes in or kicks in when your maturity level has increased, right? So automation in my eyes around threat hunting is actually the whole fact of being able to detect, right? So when can you get to that point where you've been looking for those unknowns or exploring evil, as I was saying earlier, and you found some type of key thing or indicator that you weren't typically, or you didn't have in your normal detective controls, and now you've been able to automate that and automatically just detect, right? So how can you get to that? But you know, really, you really need to narrow down. You look at, and I kind of touch on a few of these really quickly, and we'll move on. But you must narrow down exactly for which activity you are hunting. When you even think about intelligence, also is, again, like, you know, the adversary side is important. Gary and I were actually discussing this earlier today, but he made a really good point, right? You know, it's just on the side. It's important, but you need to be looking at other things as well, right? Are you looking for exploitation? Are you looking for lateral movement? Is it exfiltration? understanding those specific techniques is really important, and not just understanding the actual person behind it. So you need to understand both sides of things when you look at threat intelligence. I'll touch on data real quick, and I know Gary's going to discuss data in more in depth, but let me just touch on the data side. What you're hunting will determine where you will find the activity, right? So what you must narrow down the sources of telemetry as well, which will provide visibility into the activity and access to that telemetry, right? So you really need to understand that aspect, and we touched on that earlier before as well. So let's move on to the next slide, and I think there is one on people. Yeah, I'll talk through this as well. So when we're talking about people and process now, yeah, so really at the beginner side of things, right? We're really when you look at your organization, look at your organization, look at your team. Typically, when you're assessing and you're just beginning this, you'll find that it's someone in the SOC or your operations center, or if you've got an IR guy, you'll find that is a function, right? They do hunting as a function, and many times as you're starting out, the whole notion of hunting is actually not even how we've defined it today. It becomes very reactive. It's not so much proactive. And typically in a true cyber threat hunting model, it is very proactive, right? So, but typically in this situation, if the IR guy is doing the hunting job function, or if it's your security operations center, well, if you think about it, then that becomes basically a reactive approach, and maybe just hunting down a specific thing that they found through an alert or et cetera, right? They may be doing some hunting for anomalous data, so they might have some capabilities in their security operations center where they have a way to see just the unknowns or a large data sampling. They're basically just hunting for anomalies, right? So success from that side is basically if you found something that you didn't really find before, and it's just a big high five within the team, within the SOC. Oh wow, we found something. It's cool. Like it's really, but you're really in that beginner stage, right? So when you move into the intermediate side of things, and when you start looking at, okay, well, when you look at your organization, if you can kind of move outside of the purview of just security operations or incident response, do you actually have someone, or can you resource an actual individual that their main role or their main purpose in life in that organization is to hunt, right? Then you're moving toward that mature life cycle of having a mature hunt program, right? And then you're also starting to not just look for anomalies. You're not just responding to alerts and just hunting as a reactive approach, but you actually have a bit of a proactive stance on actually, as Matt was mentioning earlier, hunting for techniques, right? Looking for specific use cases. And basically at that point, your success is also evaluated, right? So, just because you have a role as a hunter doesn't mean that you'll be successful in it, right? So again, it's really important to have a role as a hunter, but then also that expertise that you bring and the knowledge that you have from just cybersecurity in general, right? What is that person or individual's background in cybersecurity? So typically, you're going to find that a hunter isn't someone that you just grab as a college grad that has a degree in cybersecurity and just started doing it for a year or two. It really requires a specific specialized skill set, and you really need to understand all facets of cybersecurity. So once that is evaluated and you understand, okay, well, I have been successful, then you can move into, the more advanced phases of the maturity level. And at that point, now you've started to grow a team of hunters, right? You've got numerous individuals within cybersecurity. So even me being in cybersecurity for almost 2 decades now, I'll tell you, like, I am definitely not an expert across all the domains, but I've had a knack for specific things, and I feel like I'm maybe not an expert in every single domain, but I do know a few things or two about some specific domains. Obviously security operations is one of them, and hunting is another one. But what I'm saying is that when you're growing this team, it actually works to your benefit to have a team that has backgrounds in, say, cryptography, or sysadmin backgrounds around how Windows operating systems work, having expertise in cloud environments, right? So when you're building that team, can you actually build a team that has cross functionality in cybersecurity that can then ride off of each other, right? And then at that point, you are hunting for, all of the above. You're hunting for adversaries, but then not just adversaries, but also you're hunting for techniques, tactics, and procedures. And that success is actually being measured. So then you can, again, we've talked about this time and time again throughout the presentation today, is being iterative in your approach. And once that success is measured, then you know what not to do, and you continually, better yourself around that maturity.
So on the data side, the initial, a good way to figure out where you are on this continuum is how much time you spend thinking about where your data comes from and getting the right stuff. When you start off, it tends to be very ad hoc. You've got data that's in lots of different places. You have, as an extension of the data lake, you have a whole bunch of data puddles that you spend a lot of time trying to coordinate and integrate that data. As you move forward, you start instrumenting visibility with that in mind in particular. As a result of that instrumentation, you get much more comprehensive visibility. The data has a lot less junk in it, and the data is centralized mostly. And by that we mean that it isn't necessarily all in the same place. It isn't necessarily completely synchronized, but pivoting from one data source to another doesn't take a tremendous amount of thought and effort. When you get to the advanced stage, and to be honest, very few people get to this stage of things. The design is built around visibility from the get-go. It's built with this in mind to start with. The data is clean and integrated. It is structured so you know what individual data elements mean. And if not in a physical single location, you at least have an integrated data model. This is a terrific platform if you want to build a secure environment. However, it often won't get the bills paid or do whatever it was that your business actually is supposed to do. So this is sort of a theoretical state that security people want, but is probably not practical. And I think it's important to, in all of these discussions about maturity, is that program maturity, as with developmental maturity, you're never done. You can always go forward. You can always move up and get better. But speaking for me, when I started looking at MITRE for the first time, it looked like something that was going to be just, too big a mountain to climb. But if you start climbing it, eventually you'll get there. So this is, I'm discussing it on data, but it's true across the board. Is wherever you are, assess your current location, figure out where you want to go, and start putting together some concrete steps to get there. And don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That get better at it. Get better today. If you're better today than you were yesterday, that's going to make your life a lot easier. And eventually, maybe you're going to get to the point where you're not going to spend a whole bunch of time thinking about your data and just using it instead.
Thanks, Gary. Matt, do you want to talk about tools?
I do. Gary, you don't give me anything to disagree with, man. Come on. Help me out here, right? I want to get on I want to take over and be like, absolutely not. But we'll get there eventually. So from a tool perspective, those of you looking, and again, the concept here is operationalizing this, making use out of it. For those of you just getting started, you may end up leaning on some free and open source tools, some libraries, some frameworks, some things that are built and put together that can actually help kind of walk you through the different steps here. And I'm thinking about some of those kind of standalone tools. You may be pulling back various pieces of evidence, various pieces of data, like Gary was alluding to, and you might be finding yourself doing some command line activity where you're kind of digging through, not intermediate, but you're digging through intermittent files and trying to find things, and you're kind of hunting through literally and digging through evidence or looking for evidence of something being there. Moving on kind of to the intermediate stage, I view the tools that you'll be using here, you may end up more of a commercial platform, something a little more off the shelf. It's got a little more robustness to it. Admittedly, I'm not drawing a comparison between open source or commercial at this point. I'm just simply saying that something may be a little more out of the box and ready for you. You may be taking a bunch of different data files and think back to Gary's point about sparse data versus structured and organized data, aggregating those into a SIM. And I kept the command line here as well, because I find the command line an area where you can go super easy and super beginner. You can also ratchet up and do some pretty cool command line based hunts with API calls, and you may find yourself expanding your skill set that way. And then the advanced stage of things, if you're an advanced hunting team, I'm really expecting you to be custom building your own tools, designing things that are potentially, specific to your organization. You may be taking existing tools that are out there and modifying the code to the point where it would really only fit inside of your organization. You're automating the parsing and ingestion of artifacts. You're automatically writing alerts and rules, and you've basically got a platform and you've got a toolkit that is starting to work for you. And it's taking all the things that you know that you've done and you've experienced, and it's operationalizing them for you without really skipping a beat, and allowing your team to pull on some of those, those more distant or harder to pull on threads, and it's taking care of the easier stuff for you, which is what computers are meant to do, for sure.
Thanks, Matt. Gary, Intel?
So for threat intel, this is another one of those where you can spend a lot of time on it, and you have to decide what's enough for your organization. Getting started with open source threat feeds, packaged vendor content, that sort of thing is relatively straightforward to do. You have to figure out what to do with the data and manage some false positives around it. This tends to be done more in an ad hoc sort of way. People, stuff shows up in the news, so you start updating what intel you're looking for, but it's not any kind of a scheduled or regularized process. As you move forward, you start working with curated content that's specific for an industry, with things like the ISACs of the world. You may have identified intel collectors. They may not be full-time for anything, but it's their job to spend an hour a day looking into things that they want to know, or hour a week looking into things they ought to know about. And that's going to be something that's going to be regularized and scheduled, as opposed to just whenever something interesting shows up on the news. Advanced threat intelligence will include custom analysts for a particular industry or even company. This is, again, one of those places where a lot of organizations, this is just a level of sophistication that they just don't need. But if you are a very large organization, you are very intel focused, you have got a big target on your back, in some cases, this is going to be required. This is a continuous process with governance and management structures and all sorts of, and all of the supporting accoutrements that go with that. But it gives you a custom view of the intel events that are important for your specific organization. And again, this is probably a bridge too far for most people. It would be you end up with a whole bunch of very bored analysts in most industries. But it's sort of the right end of the spectrum in terms of that advanced maturity.
Thanks, Gary. Fayez, do you want to close this out on automation?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to use a phrase that I learned from Gary here. I think of automation as punching above your weight class, right? So you're moving into that phase where you're trying to do a lot more and become much more effective in your operations around hunting. So as you're beginning this out, right, really the biggest thing is going to be understanding those repeatable hunting tasks, right? So if you've got, in any operations, there's going to be repeatable things that you're doing. So just understanding those things, right? Understanding what are those repeatable tasks. It can be as simple as looking for specific queries that you find an attacker is doing during their privilege escalation phase, or are they using specific tools? And then are you looking for specific Windows IDs? What happens after those specific Windows IDs that you find? Like, it's not just going to be a hunt, and typically just not looking for a specific Windows ID, but it's a combination of things, right? An attacker logs on, they now access PowerShell through command prompt, then they do something else, they're modifying the registry. So understanding all of those together and assessing those repeatable hunt tasks, and then moving into actually seeing how you can actually integrate those specific tools to call out and talk to each other. And then basically that success is driven by having those use cases developed. It's really just calling those things out and developing those use cases is really getting to that maturity of the next stage of actually then doing something with it, which is basically then scoping out those playbooks, right? The biggest thing in this area here is when you're in the middle tier is really, once you have those playbooks scoped, can you actually automate some of those actions, right? So again, your success is evaluated on automating those actions, and so that you're not then going for manually looking for specific things in the environment, right? And then moving into advanced is basically at that point, can you move to the next, John? There you go. And actually automating the entire hunt, right? So not just a specific action. Say, for example, a tool integration could be cross-checking against integrity of files by doing a SHA-SUM on each file. Where does it need to go to do this check, right? Are you looking at all areas around that specific check, and then basically from there assessing if it is good or bad, and then moving into some other area of specifically what you're trying to do with this hunt, right? So automate the entire hunt from beginning to end, the tactics, the techniques and procedures, and having success measured there, right? So can you then continuously improve on those metrics, and say if you have some examples I give, right? So it's not just about successful a hunt, but also how long did it take you to go through that hunt, right? How long was it, were you able to go through the entire cycle within 6 days, or were you able to go through this within a day? How long did it take you? And actually putting some time bounding around this as well, so that you're not just continuously going through this, ending that off and then restarting it, because there's going to be a time where you're going to find that, say, for example, if you've got an environment where you've got 100,000 endpoints and you're continuing to do some type of hunt, there's going to be a time where you're just going to have to end it, right? Because then once a month goes by, you're going to go recycle again and do this again and iterate on their process and make this hunt better. So if you can automate this and continue on, and maybe even at that point, you're working in parallel against some other things that you want to look for, that you can start working in parallel to further become streamlined and efficient in your process.
Great. Well, I'm looking at time here, and I want to make sure that we save a little bit of time for Q&A. This next section is kind of practical guidance for the audience. A lot of the things to think about that we have in this section, I think we've already covered. We've discussed a lot of these topics. We'll include the full slides, but maybe if we can just jump to the practical next step for each panelist. So I'll show you your slide, and you can just talk through the audience about concrete steps they can take. And then we want to quickly save time for 2 quick demonstrations that Gary and Matt are going to do here. So we're just going to look here at people and process, data, and tools. So Fayez, if there's next steps that people can take to build out their team or process, what would they be?
Yeah, I'm just going to go quickly through this, right, just in the interest of time, really. But again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, right? Adding that skill set as a role rather than just having a function, right? That's going to be really important as you progress on. One thing that I feel strongly about, even though, this is thrown around quite a bit around, machine learning, et cetera, but in the end, it all comes down to data science and what types of backgrounds would these individuals have. If you can, even if they do not have cybersecurity backgrounds, and there's a common trend going on across cybersecurity and other industries as well, is that getting those types of resources, regardless of what type of background they have, if it's not even cybersecurity, that's okay, because if you can apply data science backgrounds, you can then start apply some additional automation and machine learning techniques around it to further better your processes and become efficient in your hunting. And then have a goal, right? Make sure that you're going through specific and scheduled hunting, have timing around it, specific hunts that Matt and John will discuss, and then also collaboration will be key. So we can continue on there.
Great. Gary, next steps on data?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great truisms of all matters IT, that asset inventory is critical. You got to start off knowing what it is, what your environment looks like, understand your asset inventory, and understand what normal behavior is. A lot of security is just looking for anomalies within normal stuff, and we're pretty good at identifying what's weird. It's a little hard to figure out which of that weird is evil, particularly if you don't really understand the weird in the first place. Network monitoring is the best way to get broad aperture visibility, and that's pretty much what hunting is about, where you're trying to figure out, shaking trees and trying to figure out where else you need to go look. But those endpoints are where the fingerprints may actually lie. So encourage your vendors to cooperate. Trying to transform data is a complicated and painful thing. So if there's less of that to do, you're better off. We almost had a disagreement with Fayez earlier on the automation side. that to me, if you can automate hunting, that's called detection, and that's the goal. That you can figure out what you're hunting, turn it into a rule you can use someplace, have a machine do it for you. That's one less thing you have to have human beings do.
Thanks, Gary. Matt, can you take us home on next steps for tools?
Definitely. Yeah. So first and foremost, everyone, we talked about 3 different levels. Start. That's my first thing. Just start. 1% is greater than 0% across everything that Gary and Faiz have talked about as well. Just get something started here. If you depend on your maturity level where you're at, if you're fixing or you're starting something up, focus on visibility. Make sure you can see what it is you're looking for. Get tools that help you get there. If you're enhancing, you've already got a hunt process and you're taking it to the next level. Double check, make sure you've got visibility and start to look through things like correlation. There was a mention earlier on a previous slide about asset and software inventories. Once again, I'm speaking towards visibility. I'm just speaking to very granular visibility. Make sure your tools have the ability to track that. You can find it, you can pivot through it, you can utilize that data. And last but not least, very periodically, we've talked about hunts being an iterative process. Do the same exact thing with your tools. As your team matures, as your security program gets better, as your hunting program gets better, something that worked for you in January may not work the same for you in December of the same year. Don't hesitate to, as a team, sit down and say, this thing is just no longer giving us value. Assess, and then adjust accordingly if you need to.
Great. Thanks, Matt. We've got 5 minutes left. In the interest of time, I apologize, Matt. I'm going to cut your quick demonstration, but I do want to call out that we've done a lot of webcasts with Matt Bromley, and he's done a lot of great threat hunting demonstrations with us in the past. So if you're curious, check out some of the encrypted visibility and threat hunting content we've done with fans with Matt Bromley. You can definitely see a wealth of great demonstrations he does there. With that, maybe Gary, you could just show us one sample hunt here, kind of putting all of this into practice.
Yeah. So the hypothesis, again, you start with the hypothesis on what it is you're looking for. So the hypothesis is DNS tunneling may be in use. One of the ways you could identify that would potentially be identifying very long queries that a human being wouldn't actually type in. So in this case, we've got a Splunk query where we've arbitrarily picked the length of 60 characters being about what anybody is willing to actually type. And you end up with a whole bunch of gibberish that's all coming out of this 10.0.2.30. Once you started identifying this kind of behavior, you'd have to identify whether it's ad networks. There's lots of other places that things that it could be potentially. Maybe you'd want to fine tune it to go for to have in the next iteration have the Splunk query do groupings by host to see who's got the most numbers of callouts, that sort of thing. But again, this is one of those things that if you were to put it into detection as is, it'd be very noisy. But from a hunt, it'd be a useful way to identify unusual DNS activity.
Great. Thanks, Gary. We're just going to close out here in summary, and we'll probably have time for a question or two at the end. So I think in summary, some kind of key takeaways and pro tips here. Figure out what normal is in your environment. Threat hunting is looking for anomalous behavior, yes, but it's also an exploratory exercise, and you first need to understand what your baseline is to understand if you're looking at something strange. Look for who would be targeting you. The news often focuses on, the latest and greatest in attacks, whatever makes the headline. That's not necessarily the person going after your organization. So just because an APT is in the news doesn't mean that you're the target. But again, it's valuable to read about all of these attacks, as was mentioned at the beginning, because it'll help you understand MOs and procedures and TTPs of these folks. Because if someone else is attacking you, they may well use the same techniques. Again, MITRE ATT&CK, an excellent resource to help you frame what you're looking for out there when it comes to attacker techniques. There are over 300 documented in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You can launch and build hunts around those TTPs. It's a great way to get started, is to go pick out a few TTPs in that attack framework and go try to validate whether or not those activities are happening in your environment. And as I mentioned, I saw a threat hunting team that does exactly this, and they tag their threat hunts with TTPs. The first step to a long journey to climbing this mountain is just to get started. And, you don't have to have a comprehensive threat hunting program out of the gate. Start with, top 5 things you're looking for in your environment and iterate and add from there. You're going to learn a ton out of the gate in those first 5 hunting exercises. And lastly, again, it's a combination of breadth and depth, and the network is great for breadth. It gives you that wide aperture view so you can understand what's holistically happening across your network, shake those trees, find those strange things, and then dig in at an endpoint or host level to that detail. And one last thing here I'll just mention quickly is Corelight has an introduction to threat hunting guide for Zeek logs. And if you're not familiar, that's a network threat hunting type of log. So it's a network log. And if you're curious and would like a copy of that, feel free to reach out to us at info@corelight.com. It has very practical walkthroughs of how to hunt using those type of logs as a follow-on to this presentation. With that, we've got about a minute left. So unfortunately, I think I'm just going to be able to take one question here. So I'll give priority to the first question that was asked in this presentation. Let's see here. We have a question. What are the most widely used techniques for threat hunting, and do they differ by industry? Quick take, starting with Gary.
Yes, they're wildly variable by industry, just because you're looking for different things. If you're looking for insider activity, you're going to get a very different thing than if you're looking for exfiltration or financial theft. Probably as far as techniques go, wow, that's a great question. I actually, Matt, you have probably a better experience on the practical front in the currently. What do you take on? What's your take on the most broadly used techniques?
Yeah, no, for sure. Great question there. Thanks to who asked that. So a couple different types of hunts that I see as some of the most popular out there. First is, Gary was 100% correct. Gary, I'll agree with you again. Sorry. It does differ wildly between industries and even between companies inside of the same industry. The types of threat hunts, though, we'll see intelligence-led hunts. We've talked a lot about intelligence-led hunts here. We'll see kind of I'm going to call them anomaly-based hunts, but they're like the things that don't make sense inside of your environment, right? And that's not necessarily any intelligence-driven. It's just more of understanding what's normal, what's not normal. And I'll call them anomaly or outlier-led hunts, if you will. There's it's kind of a third category. It's a little bit of a blend of the two. I don't want to call it necessarily an intelligence-led hunt, but we may call it more of a technique-based hunt that you'll see done, where I'm not focused on a particular group or a threat intel report. I'm not looking for something because someone else is tipping me off. But what I may be doing instead is I may be saying, hey, team, I want to see what our visibility is into privilege escalation. So we're going to conduct a hunt to see what we can and can't see. And there you're doing it for edification and organizational awareness as well as detection if you find anything. But again, your starting point's a little different, but fantastic question. Back to you, John.
All right. With that, we are at time. Fayez, Matt, Gary, thank you so much for lending your time and wisdom. I hope you guys learned something today. I certainly did. And hopefully this will give you the ammunition to get started on your next step of your threat hunting journey. Carol, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, John, Fayez, Gary, and Matt for your great presentation, and to Corelight and Optiv for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.